Thank you very much for coming to join us. I've just been asked to let you know that this is putting human rights at the heart of trade policy. So if you're expecting a debate about green energy, well, it's too late now. We've closed and locked the doors. But of course, the real reason you're here is to see someone who really requires very little in the way of introduction to discuss a really important issue of putting human rights at the heart of trade policy. Now we've left the European Union, a very new area of public policy comes back here to the United Kingdom. Could surely have no better person to be shadowing it than Emily Thornberry, who will give a speech, and then the rest of our excellent panel, who I will introduce as we go, will respond to the speech before throwing it open to your questions, which we are taking via the white heat of technology, via this thing, which I'm hoping, as I'm pointing at it, airline steward style, is explaining how to submit it onto here, where I will read off your questions. They will be filtered by someone else, so if your question is silly, then I'm not going to see it. It's a waste of everyone's time. But yeah, if you just submit it through here. But without further ado, the MP for Islington South, Shadow International Trade Secretary, Emily Thornberry, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for that introduction. And I'd like to thank Anand and Roy and Yasmin for making this such a varied and expert panel. You know, everybody, you're going to have a real treat today. This is my second collaboration of the year with the New Statesman. The first was in February, when we commemorated the 25th anniversary of Robin Cook's famous speech in Parliament on the Arms to Iraq scandal. And it dawned on me, working on that event, that the central truth which Robin exposed back in 1996 is back with us again today. If ministers regard their job simply as to do as many deals as possible, and there is no legal framework, no transparency, no scrutiny to constrain them, then why should they care who buys UK goods or what they do with them? In those circumstances, Robin realised the decision to sell arms to a dictator is not an aberration. It is a logical consequence of government policy. No laws, no transparency, no scrutiny. A recipe for reckless decision-making and a total disregard for human rights. In government, Robin introduced constraints into the arms export regime, and in June 2019, we saw them in action. The campaign against the arms trade was able to show that ministers were breaching the law, requiring them to assess the risk that arms sold to Saudi Arabia were being used to violate law in international law in Yemen. The Court of Appeal agreed and suspended those exports. Now, Liz Truss was new in post to Trade Secretary, and what she could have done was that she could have told the Saudis that was it. That was it until they stopped targeting civilians, but instead, she worked for a year trying to find a way round Robin Cook's constraints. And in July 2020, based on the fresh government assessments, which she refused to share with Parliament, despite my hundreds of demands, she concluded that any violations of international law were isolated incidents, although she refused to tell Parliament how many, despite my hundreds of requests. And that, having now properly considered the risks, she could safely resume UK exports of arms to Saudi Arabia. Just 5 days after that decision, a Saudi jet fired a US-made missile at a civilian home in northwest Yemen, killing 9 members of the same family, all women, children and toddlers. Yet another so-called isolated incident. You may think that that fresh massacre and the previous judgment of the courts would have persuaded Liz Truss to act cautiously. But instead, from July to September last year, she authorised the sale of £1.4 billion worth of bombs and missiles to Saudi Arabia, almost as much as the previous 19 quarters all put together. What she exposed, though, through those decisions in 2020 is what I warned about here in Brighton at conference in 2017, that the arms export regime introduced by Robin Cook may have been a vast improvement, but it was still too reliant on the subjective judgments of ministers. And when the minister is bereft of all morality and all conscience, as Liz Truss is, we know that every judgment will fall in favour of arms dealers and dictators and against the protection of civilian life. And it is no coincidence that from the moment Truss came into her role in 2019, that attitude that the attitude towards human rights should not constrain the flow of trade became entrenched in the department's policy and will continue even now that she's left. Besides Yemen, she took 3 other crucial steps. First, and most brazen, Truss boasted about rolling over post-Brexit trade deals with some of the most abusive regimes in the world, the likes of Colombia, Egypt, Turkey and Zimbabwe, with no attempt to strengthen the human rights provisions in those deals and no apparent qualms over whether they should be signed at all. I thought at least she might hesitate over the deal with the corrupt and murderous regime of Cameroon's President Biya, engaged since 2017 in a brutal campaign of violence against his country's English-speaking minority community. After all, in January 2020, even Donald Trump had cancelled Cameroon's trade preferences because, I quote, its persistent gross violations of human rights against its own citizens. In February 2020, Biya's regime raided the village of Nagabo, and in a war where most of the dying is done by those who can't run, that is who they found. They found the elderly, pregnant women, mothers with toddlers, so they massacred 21 of them, including 9 children under the age of 5. And in September 2020, the Republican-controlled US Senate tabled a resolution urging America's allies to use, I quote, all available diplomatic tools to put pressure on the Biya regime to stop, I quote, its massacres and burnings of villages. But in December 2020, despite all of that, the Biya regime was handed its new trade deal by Liz Truss, with continued preferential access to the UK market and no questions asked. Second, and most pernicious, in the course of those rollover negotiations, Truss quietly broke from a principle that successive UK governments have supported since 1995, and I just want to explain what that is. Trade deals are supposed to be a two-way street, right? Mostly between 2 developed countries. That's a simple exchange of benefits. You sell me that, I'll sell you this. But with less developed countries, there's a different dynamic. There, we've historically tended to say, we will give you preferential access to our market to help support your economy, and we want to set certain conditions that include respect for human rights, workers' rights, and democracy on the other side. And so in 1995, it was agreed that every new EU trade deal would make human rights an essential element, allowing the treaty to be suspended if the human rights commitments were broken. Liz Truss edged away from that principle in her deals with Turkey, Singapore and Vietnam, but she claimed she was merely replicating the specific EU treaties that came before because, for example, EU-Turkey agreement had been signed back in 1964 and therefore before the 1995 changes. For her deal with Norway and Iceland, there was no such excuse, but nobody cared because those countries are not at the forefront of human rights abuse. And I predict the same will be true of Australia. But what does it do? The reason it's important is that having broken that principle, it means that the government can now strike a deal with Gulf states and with Brazil with no sign of human rights clauses and no need to hold up negotiations by seeking one. And third, and perhaps most amazing of all, Truss initiated a review in July, which is still ongoing, into human rights conditions that the UK applies when it gives preferential trade to low and middle income countries. Again, those conditions exist so that when we give preferential access to those countries, the benefits of that access go at least in part to working people of those countries to support their jobs and their economic development, and it is a lever to try and ensure that their human rights are not being abused by authoritarian governments. If we don't have those conditions in place, then we run the risk that the benefits of preferential access to our market will just go to brutal governments who are abusing those people's human rights and profiting from their labour. Now, having refused to enforce those conditions after clear violations by Cambodia and Sri Lanka early in 2021, Truss opened the door to scrapping them entirely. It is worth noting the argument Truss used. Whenever I have asked her why she won't enforce those conditions or indeed human rights clauses in her rollover deals, time after time she tells me that it would not be the poorest people in those countries, that it would be the poorest people in those countries who would suffer the most if we took action through the trade system to try and protect their human rights. In other words, what she's trying to tell me is this. She's looking after female garment workers in Cambodia by refusing to protest the denial of their labour rights. She's telling me that what she's doing is she's looking after villagers in Cameroon by refusing to suspend Britain's trade deal with the bio regime. And if that sounds familiar, and to some of us it will, many of us will know that that is exactly the same argument that Margaret Thatcher used in the 1980s to defy the calls for sanctions against South Africa. Margaret Thatcher was only looking out for the interests of black South Africans. She said she knew better. She knew better about what was good for them than Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu or Alan Bosak. And on this very day, 36 years ago, when Mozambique's President Machel lobbied her in Downing Street, Thatcher said she knew better than him. And now we have Liz Truss repeating the same morally bankrupt, intellectually vacant argument to insist that trade cannot be used to defend human rights. For the last 18 months, I have tried, along with the rest of the Labour Party, MPs from other parties and campaign groups across the country, to impose constraints on Truss and her successors through the parliamentary process. 3 times earlier this year, we debated amendments to the trade bill which would have made trade conditional on countries' human rights records or given Parliament the right to vote on all trade agreements so that they could veto deals with abusive regimes. After all, as I said in those debates, if we don't have laws in place to limit the actions of ministers, then we need at least final say over the actions that they propose. Personally, obviously, I would have preferred both, and most MPs agreed we needed at least one or the other. Only the government insisted that we should have neither, and fought ferociously in those debates to ensure that that was the outcome. Because just as Robin Cook exposed in 1996, when it comes to their decisions on trade, they want no laws, no transparency, and no scrutiny. And we should just pause for a second to ask why. It's tempting to think that it's because they're sympathetic to those abusive regimes, the way that Thatcher was to Pinochet, or that there's some level of corruption involved, just as there was with Jonathan Aitken back in the days of arms to Iraq. But I believe that the primary reason is just more basic than that. And like most things with regard to this government, it comes back to Brexit. The more the damage accumulates from Boris Johnson's botched agreement with the EU, the more stubbornly he refuses to fix the holes in that deal, the more desperate his government is becoming to secure trade deals elsewhere in a doomed attempt to make up for losses. The more desperate they become for those deals, the more impossible it becomes for them to criticise the conduct of those countries and their leaders, whether it's Bolsonaro burning down the Amazon, Netanyahu bombing children in Gaza, or Bin Salman murdering journalists in Istanbul. That's why the government is completely incapable of taking clear, strong, consistent positions on issues like human rights, and why they refuse to be subject to any laws, transparency, or scrutiny which would bind their hands. That is the logical consequence of their Brexit trade policy. And one of the reasons that matters is when we're asked the inevitable question, well, how would Labour be any different? And wouldn't we face the same pressures to do deals with people that we don't like? One big difference is that we can afford to make different choices because our central priority will be fixing our trading relationship with Europe. We would not be forced into chasing the relatively small gains, for example, from a free trade deal with Brazil, where our exports last year were one-fifth of the total that we sold to Belgium. But of course, much more than financial factors, we know it is our principles and our values that will make a Labour government different when it comes to human rights and trade. We know that our history of solidarity with oppressed brothers and sisters across the world would compel us to make different choices to Liz Truss and her colleagues. But we also know, and I think that this is probably the most important lesson to learn from Robin Cook, those principles and values cannot by themselves deliver change. As Robin found out in the Foreign Office, it's not good enough just to introduce ethical new policies because they are far too easy for your cabinet colleagues to undermine or your successors to unpick. What you need, above all, is to introduce new laws and change the system to an extent that is politically impossible to reverse. So, at TUC Congress earlier this month, I proposed 5 new laws that a future Labour government will introduce in the area of trade and human rights. I said we will amend the Trade Act in a way the government refused to do, enabling Parliament to block new trade deals with countries engaged in serious abuses of human rights, and enshrining in law the principle that there must be meaningful, enforceable human rights clauses as essential elements of every deal. We will legislate for the publication of an annual assessment of human rights and workers' rights in each country which enjoys preferential trade with the UK to determine if they are complying with our conditions and should continue to receive it. We will legislate for the expansion of new due diligence laws, obliging major UK corporations to police their own supply chains, ensure that they are not complicit in the violation of human rights, and face serious financial penalties if they fail. But because that policing cannot be left to business alone, we will also legislate for targeted import bans on goods coming to the UK from factories and farms overseas where forced labour and child labour are being used, including from the Uyghur camps in Xinjiang. And to undermine all these changes, we will legislate so that Parliament always has a guaranteed right to debate and vote on any proposal from the government to negotiate, agree or renew each trade agreement. In all those areas, a future Labour government will actively choose to impose new laws on ourselves, and new requirements for transparency and scrutiny, not just to improve our own decision-making, but to constrain the actions of all future governments who might follow us. And in conclusion, I have one more change that I want to propose today, rooted in the same objectives and inspired by Robin Cook's work on arms exports 25 years ago. The British Armed Forces and Police are rightly regarded as the most skilled and professional in the world. It is no surprise that countries from every continent send their personnel to the UK to learn from ours. And we benefit from that training too. It helps our foreign counterparts to tackle the collective threats that we face, like terrorism and cybercrime, and the relationship we establish plays a vital long-term role in protecting British citizens and interests overseas. But there is an inescapable problem. If all countries wish to learn from ours, we will inevitably find situations where some of the training being provided in Britain is used to abuse human rights overseas, ranging from brutal repression of peaceful protesters to indiscriminate targeting of civilians in war. Some people will argue that conduct of overseas forces would be even worse if it wasn't for our training. But where's the evidence of that? In 2014, David Cameron's government decided, despite warnings of campaigners, that it was time to restore training links with the military in Myanmar in recognition of the transition to democratic rule. 5 times from 2014 to 2017, senior military leaders from Myanmar took part in MOD flagship courses to teach security forces about their human rights responsibilities. Twice the MOD put on courses in Myanmar itself. And yet, when those leaders launched their genocide against the Rohingya in 2017, gang-raping women, attacking children, killing indiscriminately, burning entire villages, the UN concluded that their acts of extreme brutality were only possible in a climate where military personnel had no reasonable fear of punishment or disciplinary action. We cannot tell ourselves that British training is always a force for good when we have examples like that. When it had been anything but. But also, we should mention UK-trained snipers in Bahrain or secret police in Saudi Arabia during the Arab Spring. So today, I am publishing a new report on this issue, which asks one fundamental question. Why are decisions to provide military and security training to overseas governments not made on the same basis as decisions on whether to sell them arms? After all, there is no practical difference between selling Saudi Arabia an attack jet to use against civilians in Yemen and training a Saudi pilot to fly it. So when the courts ordered the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia to be stopped in 2019, why were almost 100 training courses for coalition forces authorised in the same year, attack pilots included? Under the current system, such as it is, the government is supposed to conduct risk assessment in relation to each training request. But they cannot tell us how many requests they've actually turned down in the last 5 years, if any at all, or even how many were judged as high risk. And so you have to ask, if those requests from Brazil, Hong Kong and Myanmar for public order trading were not considered too risky, which requests would have been? Cameroon, which requested no training at all in the 2 years before their assault on the country's English-speaking minority, have since received 3 rounds of advanced command courses for senior officers, as well as battle training for platoon commanders, and nowhere, apparently, has that raised any red flags. My report today contains dozens of further examples along those lines. And what they all come down to is what Robin Cook exposed 25 years ago. When there are no laws, no transparency and no scrutiny, the government can do whatever it wants. So I can announce that a future Labour government will impose the same legal controls and transparency requirements over the provision of military and security training to overseas forces as we apply to the export of arms. It will be unlawful for ministers to authorise training where there is a serious risk it will be used by the recipient forces to violate international law or engage in acts of internal repression or external aggression. Like arms exports, the decisions made by ministers on training will be published on a quarterly basis, and like arms exports, those decisions will be subject to scrutiny by Parliament and challenge in the courts. And most importantly, when we conduct the root and branch reform of the arms export regime, which I promised here in Brighton in 2017, whatever changes we will make to that system will apply equally to the provision of training as well. If we reform these rules correctly, it will not affect the prestige or popularity of the training we offer in the UK, but it will give us greater confidence that those lessons will always be used as a force for good, to uphold the rule of law, to protect innocent citizens around the world, and never, as much as we can ever help it, to do the opposite. And this, for me, can become the prime example of our entire approach to the issue of human rights and trade, and how we intend to turn this issue around in government. Trade should not require us to suspend our morals, as Thatcher and Truss and Boris Johnson would have you believe. Trade can be used to place pressure on overseas regimes and change their conduct, as Desmond Tutu and Robin Cook both thought it could. It can be used to demonstrate the principles and values we stand for as a country. It can be used as a positive force for good in the world and as a silver bullet for the promotion of human rights. And all that should be the logical consequence of a Labour trade policy once we are restored to government. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for all of the excellent questions that have come in so far. Do please keep them coming in. Rory Rickers is General Secretary of Community, which represents everyone from steel workers to employees in NGOs and charities. So if you could respond, please, to Emily.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's Roy Rickers, I'm the General Secretary of Community. I think it was a really powerful and thoughtful speech there, Emily, and a couple of the issues from a trade union perspective, I think is, I do agree with you. We appear to be running around the world trying to do grubby trade deals with anybody that'll have us, and it is about Brexit, and it is about that, trying to defend that sort of position. The transparency and the scrutiny that you talked about, I think for us is absolutely vital. Now, the government have established, I think it's 11, the DIT have established 11 of these tags, as they call them, these trade advisory groups. Because of TUC lobbying and pressure, they agreed that they would have trade union representatives on these tags. The trade unions put forward the names of nominations to sit on these tags back in January, and we're still waiting. We still have no indication that they've accepted or they're going to put the trade union people on these groups. And nobody knows their industries, I would dare to say, better than the trade unions, and the impact on these trade agreements that it will have on jobs and work. And more importantly, that the rights of workers and people and trade unions in other countries that we want to do business with. You know, the old saying, you can be known by your friends as well as your enemies. We are looking to join this Trans-Pacific group. They're in negotiations. You know, there's 11 countries, I think, in that group, Emily, and in 2 of those countries, trade unions are even banned. Yeah. So we're happy to sit down and do trade agreements with countries where trade unions are openly banned. It's a no-brainer as well for business, because we're going to see that if we do these trade agreements, we're going to find it even harder to compete with countries that are importing into our country that are using forced labour, slave labour, cheap labour, non-unionised labour. You know, there is a threat to our jobs as well if we don't stand up against this, as well as doing what's right by people in other countries. We want to see them have better rights. We want to see them have better standards of living and be represented by recognised trade unions. So there's one final ask that I know hopefully you'll take on board in terms of the scrutiny and the transparency that you were putting forward there, is that there should be legislation that says there will be trade union representatives on these tags and these trade negotiation bodies.
Okay. Thank you. Peter Franktel is Economic Affairs Programme Director at Amnesty International. So thank you. Peter, if you could give your thoughts on what we've discussed.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, I mean, it's very heartening to hear what you said in the direction of Labour Party policy. Very clear. The UK's international human rights obligations cannot be allowed to stop when it comes to trade and foreign direct investment. The effectiveness of the policy measures that you've signalled will depend on the extent to which they're coherent, the extent to which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, identifying some of the gaps in the institutional infrastructure, and considering how far they're actually likely to drive change. Human rights clauses, conditionalities in trade agreements have a very mixed history in terms of their enforceability. It's not just about robust and enforceable clauses, it's also about the political will. Yeah. A decision to actually invoke a clause to suspend an agreement would involve the Foreign Office, the Department of Business, Department of International Trade, maybe the MOD, the Treasury, and that decision would in practice likely be taken by the Cabinet Office, and it might well not be taken on human rights grounds. But setting aside human rights conditionalities in trade agreements, it's absolutely essential that the actual provisions, the substantive provisions of trade agreements, should be subject to detailed and comprehensive impact assessments, environmental and human rights. Trade agreements have enormous implications for human rights. It's very positive that Labour's signalling that Parliament will have a role in agreeing the negotiating principles, and also will set aside the CRAG process, that's the constitutional process by which international agreements are effectively rubber-stamped by Parliament without proper scrutiny. Absolutely essential that trade agreements should be subject to parliamentary and public scrutiny. And very positive also that you've signalled that investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms will no longer be used in future UK trade agreements. These mechanisms provide disincentives for states to give effect to their international human rights and environmental obligations if this would mean imposing costs on business. So there are a number of companies that are suing states in Europe for trying to give effect to their emissions targets under the Paris Agreement by phasing out coal-fired power stations. Some of these settlements amount to hundreds of millions, so very positive on ISDS. On due diligence requirements, that's also extremely positive because the main vehicles for international trade and investment are multinational corporations. If multinational corporations aren't held properly accountable, human rights will never be at the centre, at the heart of trade policy. So really positive to have a due diligence requirement. That needs to be matched with a duty on companies to prevent human rights violations and environmental harm. The reason that there needs to be a duty to prevent is that that gives the prospect of relating that to the civil liability system. So if a company has not failed to prevent human rights harm and environmental damage, then those adversely affected can use the UK courts to seek damages. If a company commits serious human rights violations or contributes to them, or environmental harm, then the criminal law can kick in. So very important that that duty to prevent should exist. So yes, some very positive signals that are being sent. Obviously this is going to be work in progress, and all of our organisations here will want to help you and colleagues in taking that forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Jasmine O'Connor is CEO of Anti-Slavery International, and if you could also respond to Emily's remarks.
Yeah, well, I just love any speech that starts by evoking the spirit of dear Robin Cook, personally. And indeed, that spirit is, you know, you can see a direct line through to these policies, that, you know, the policies need to evolve to laws that have teeth. So I really do endorse the kind of additional points that have been made around mandatory human rights and environmental due diligences. That needs to happen in order to have that criminal liability. So we really would support that from anti-slavery's perspective. I think the other piece that I'd add there is that it needs to get to the heart of some of these business models. You know, the rules that we have at the moment are just a tick box exercise that don't look at the heart of the business models that can drive slavery in the sort of purchasing practices, in the ways that these incredibly complex supply chains often work. So I'd add that point there as well. I think from our perspective, it's worth just stating the problem as it is, that today there are 40 million people in modern slavery globally. That's about 1 in every 200 people on the planet. And 25 million of those are in forced labour. And, you know, it doesn't take much to look at what's going on in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region to see what that looks like when it's on steroids. So we do welcome, in particular, the genocide amendment, and we do welcome the import bans as well, which will work for these most egregious systemic forced labour situations. I think a couple of other points that I would make is that, you know, when we're looking at this whole system that's required, the importance of trade union voices and civil society voices on the ground, and indeed in countries where the organising of trade unions is not permitted or is very nascent, how important it is to make sure that those individuals who are most affected by forced labour or by any kind of human rights abuse are engaged in those trade discussions and deals, but are also engaged in actually developing this legislation. And we would argue that, again, you know, they are those who understand the context that they're in most rapidly, and actually they're asking for those robust mechanisms so that they can call upon their own governments. Yeah. So, you know, to really put pay to the kind of, you know, Margaret Thatcher idea that they're not asking for these things. They are. Yeah. They're asking for them because they want us to stand in solidarity, and they want to be able to use that in their own advocacy with their own governments. And so I think that's extremely important to remember as well. I think the other comment that I'd probably make is that, you know, the need for all of this to be mindful of climate change, and indeed for the mandatory human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence to be there, but that's also to extend to the kind of environmental harms that can occur. I think the very final point that I would probably make is that, you know, we at Anti-Slavery, you know, recognise the challenge of these policies and getting them into legislation, getting them into practice. I'm obviously a CEO of a charity. I can't be political, but we stand by to support you and the Labour Party to be making that broad-based coalition even while you're working to get back into government, so that really we can start teeing things up to see these provisions passed into law. Thank you.
Thank you. And Anand Menon is Director of UK and a Changing Europe, Foreign Policy Fellow at King. So if you could also respond to Emily's speech, please.
Yeah, I'll be very, very... Actually, Emily, I was just thinking the last time we were in one of these rooms together, we had to break off to listen to the Supreme Court's
That's right.
judgment on prorogation a couple of
room.
years ago in this room, wasn't it?
Room.
Yeah, I was just remembering.
And we all packed up and left.
Yeah, exactly. so, I mean, I broadly welcome what you said, but I don't want to turn this into a love-in, so I'm going to try and sort of challenge you a little bit.
I knew you'd give me a hard time, it's all right.
So I've got a comment, a warning, and a suggestion. The comment is, you know, it would be nice if we put trade at the heart of trade policy in this country, because no one talks about trade as trade. I think I've never said this to you before, I think you let the government off a bit lightly on its post-Brexit trade deal agenda. This has nothing to do with economics. They're not trying to make up for the loss of Brexit. This is purely performative. Yeah. This is signing as many as you can to wave them around and show that you have. It's almost signing as many as you can that do as little as possible economically, because if they do stuff economically, you've got domestic consequences that you're going to have to manage. So, you know, look at the discussions with Australia. So at some point in this country, we need to have a conversation about trade as trade, is the first thing I would say. The warning is, it is great to put principles at the heart of your foreign policy, but you're always going to confront trade-offs. That's to say, small states, developing states are easy. What happens with China? You know, there are really difficult trade-offs when it comes to economics and values when it comes to China. And there are equally hierarchies of values when it comes to foreign and trade policy. So, Malaysia and India, shocking records when it comes to workers' rights in those countries. You might have India, don't get me started on the reasons why we might not want to sign trade deals with India. But we have a foreign policy that has a certain view on China. Is deterring China or creating an alliance of like-minded nations in China more important than upholding human rights standards when it comes to trade policies? I'm not saying one or the other is. All I'm saying is we shouldn't be blind to the fact that there are trade-offs. And finally, the suggestion is to do with politics. You know, you know what the government will say in answer to what you're going to lay out. The government will weaponize values. That's what the government does very well. Snowflake, lefties, whatever. Okay, and my suggestion comes from this. Two things to say. One, the British people, as a rule, don't care about trade policy. There was a recent poll that showed that 7% of people realise we've got a trade deal with Japan. The British people do care about specific rights, standards and values. Yes. 90% of the British people don't want a lowering of food standards in any trade deal. When you propose this, do it with concrete examples as well as a rhetoric of values. Because actually, if you talk about the Uyghurs, or if you talk about post-Skripal, you get enormous public backing for actions to be taken. If you talk in the rather vaguer languages of values, it goes down very well at conference, but in the wider political arena, it needs to be backed up with specifics, I think.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, no, cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of your remarks. Thank you for that very good speech. And thank you for your brilliant questions, which we'll now get to. Now, Emily, not a lot of people have noticed that you are now also in charge of Brexit policy for the Labour Party. But one person who has noticed is Adam, who asks, there's growing talk that the government's preparing to trigger Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol potentially this week. What will Labour do in that scenario?
So we have this really thin deal. You know, we all know that we have it. We signed it on Christmas Eve, for goodness sake. You know, I think that, like an awful lot of people, it was so much down to the wire that we were just incredibly relieved that there was something signed at all. And then as time has gone on, we've realised just how many holes there are in it, how thin it is, how inadequate it is. It has within it various mechanisms that could be used with goodwill on both sides to patch some of these holes up and for us to be able to develop it. But what's happened is that all goodwill has disappeared into the vortex, which is the issue of Northern Ireland. And because we've not been able to move on and not been able to find a solution to it, and it seems as though there's just an upping of the ante all the time. I mean, I frankly don't think that either side is behaving particularly reasonably, if I must be honest. The idea that you can have your truck turned around because the form has been filled in the wrong colour pen is just, ridiculous. And these examples do exist of pettiness on the European side. But frankly, there is also an upping of the ante which is going on the British side too. And it plays good politics. It's good campaigning stuff. It's kind of, it's keeping the Brexit bruise, going. But it doesn't do us any good in the end. It's not about governing the nation and making appropriate decisions to govern the nation best. It's just about stirring people up again and again. And we cannot allow Northern Ireland to continue to be in limbo. But, if we do trigger Article 16, then we're going to end up with not only problems in terms of Northern Ireland, but I was having meetings with business today. I think Bill is here, who was at those meetings with us, and the concern of industry throughout the country, all sorts of different sectors, as to what will happen if we trigger Article. It is a real problem, and just what it will do. We cannot forget 50% of our trade is with our nearest neighbours. Surprise, surprise. We cannot jeopardise that in good relationships with our nearest neighbours. So it would be reckless nonsense for them to trigger at this stage, and they really must not do it. We have to continue to talk to the European Union, and it's about time we had a few grown-ups involved in this, people who are pragmatists and who are going to leave dogma at the door.
Thank you. So I'm going to composite some of these because there are a lot of very good questions, but please do keep them coming in. How can Labour ensure there is a political and electoral cost for the mishandling of trade deals, and how can the trade unions and other campaigning groups also similarly scrutinise these deals, seeing as they currently obviously do not, they quite deliberately do not get much scrutiny in Parliament? Roy, I wondered if you wanted to lead off on that one.
Well, yeah, like I said earlier, it's important that trade unions are involved, and it would be great to see that happen. The government have said that they're going to allow trade unions onto these trade bodies, but we haven't seen anything yet. So we have to keep fighting, we have to keep campaigning, and we have to make sure that we're representing the views of working people. I make no apology for saying that we can do that as well by working with good employers. If you take my union, we represent a lot of people, thousands of workers in manufacturing and principally in the steel industry. So we have a relationship, a good working relationship with UK Steel. And I've always believed, rightly or wrongly, that lobbying is more powerful on behalf of an industry if you're lobbying together as an industry. It's harder then for government to ignore or to say, well, the unions would say that. So we have a good working relationship with UK Steel. We don't agree on everything. We're never going to agree on everything. But when we go to government and lobby, then I think it carries more weight because we are lobbying as an industry rather than as unions or employers. So that's what I'd say. We need to build coalitions, we need to build partnerships, and we need to make sure that when we make these representations, they cannot ignore us, because if they can, then they will.
Yeah. But may I just, but you're hiding your light under a bushel. The steel industry was under a severe threat just a couple of months ago, because what had happened had been, because of overproduction across the whole of basically the Americans introduced these protections for their steel industry, the Europeans introduced protections for their steel industry, Britain had protections because we were part of the EU, we leave the EU, guess what? Guess what their headbangers in DIT wanted to do? They wanted to lift all the protections. Absolutely. So that we would have then exposed the steel industry to dumping on a massive scale. It would have been the end of the steel industry. But it wasn't.
No.
Well, so, hey.
Well, we didn't want this to become a love-in, so I'd have had to say that we have to thank you and your team for what you did. No, we came together and we made the representations, and at the 11th hour, you're absolutely right, Liz Truss sort of did this U-turn and put some of the safeguards, not all of the safeguards, but you put some of the safeguards back in. Our problem is we don't know how long those safeguards will last, so we cannot take our eye off the ball. But it was an example of what I said earlier about the unions, employers and the party coming together, making those strong representations and finally forcing the government into a U-turn at the 11th hour.
Yeah.
So it was a team effort.
Yeah.
I'd sort of really endorse that. The coalition building is really, really important. And it's something anti-slavery that we're doing, working with a number of businesses who do not want to be sourcing from the Xinjiang region in China. They do not want to. They are struggling sometimes to sign up to our commitments because of the repercussions that they sometimes receive or they fear. They need government to take action. And so there's a voice there, I think. We're also working with a particular insurance provider who, Fidelis Insurance, who have been working with Lloyd's of London to get clauses into marine cargo contracts to kind of leverage that industry so that you cannot buy insurance for your cargo if you can't prove that due diligence has taken place. And so there are initiatives across a number of different industries, and I do think there are voices that we can corral in this debate, because actually those are some of the voices that this government will hopefully listen to. They're not going to listen to me. I wish they would, but they don't.
Thank you. Peter, would you like to come in as well on this, or? Anna, do you? Wonderful, thank you. And sorry, it's gone to sleep. Right, several questions in this vein. It seems obvious to use trade to have as a lever to improve human rights and as part of an arm of an ethical foreign policy. So, why do you think this hasn't happened before, and why will it be different this time?
Well, it's not happened before because we haven't had a trade policy before, because basically the European Union did trade for us. And so that's the thing, the reason that we need to be talking about this, the reason I'm so keen to get out and talk to them, because we need to start making some decisions about what do we want to do with trade. So I think that our trade policy should augment our economic policy. We should be looking at what sectors, the sectors of the future, do they need access to this market or that market? How do we make sure we look after it? And then how do we use trade as a reflection of our values and sort of a bit like a bit of sort of muscle behind our foreign policy, I suppose, in a way. I think, but, we need to have this debate. But, you go somewhere like Australia or New Zealand that have had to live by their wits, have had to have trade policy all these years, and they really get it. And it isn't just the politicians, actually. Other people get it too. Whereas this is all new to us, and it's understandable that people don't really know, they don't have the confidence to talk about it. But we do need to. If we're going to develop a trade policy as a country, we have to engage not just civic society, but actually, you guys. People need to be able to talk about trade with some confidence.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right and true, and I think it's also the direction of travel.
Yes.
I think smart people around the world are waking up to the kind of atrocities, of our dear friends in the Uyghur region. And they're saying this isn't good enough. So I think that the policies that you've announced are, by far and away some of the most comprehensive. And it's incredibly exciting to see that, and incredibly exciting to hopefully be a part of that. But I think there is also a direction of travel in America. They were already banning imports from forced labour. There's that direction of travel in Europe as well, with just recently announcements there that they're going to be looking at the Commission is going to be looking at introducing the sort of import bans from that perspective, and are also already looking at mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. So I think there's a kind of overall global piece to this, that we will be disadvantaging British business if we aren't a part of this direction of travel. I promise I'm not going to go into the details of this as well, but there's also a whole aspect when it comes to climate change. Absolutely.
And the way in which you can use trade to underpin, policies on climate change. Yeah. So, there was the British High Commissioner in Australia was jumping up and down and, very smugly saying, the trade deal with Australia is going to be fantastic. It's going to underpin their commitment to Paris, and we're actually going to winkle out of them how they're going to get to net zero. don't really know, but they did say that's what they were getting. But that would have been, that would have been really interesting. That would have been, we'll do a trade deal with Australia, but actually as part of that, we will be expecting, what is your glide path down to net zero? And as one of the biggest polluters in the world, that would have been a hell of a feather, and that would have been trade policy used for really positive good. And then, there's also there's a New Zealand initiative, which is you're trying to get groups of like-minded people together to work on, how we work on fighting climate change together as a group, sort of at the World Trade Organization. And why we're not a member of that group, I don't know.
Thank you. I'm very aware that I need to ask you to wrap up, and I haven't got through many of your excellent questions. So I'm going to ask you all to wrap up and also to consider this, I think, very good question, which is, is there an area of the world that you think trade policy should be particularly focused on in terms of these issues around human rights, even if it's somewhere with a fairly low economic importance? I'm going to ask you to go in the reverse order. I call on you the first time, so Emily will get the last word. So, Anand, I'm afraid I can ask you to think very fast on that.
I think in terms of both foreign policy and trade policy, we need to give far more attention to sub-Saharan Africa. We need to give far more attention to sub-Saharan Africa because it's the place where many of these abuses are still endemic. We need to give attention to sub-Saharan Africa because there is going to be a migration crisis like the like of which we have never seen before if the population of that continent explodes as we expect it to. It's very striking that the integrated review hardly mentions that part of the world, and we don't talk about it anywhere near enough. And when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, I was talking about earlier, the intersection between foreign policy, the need to bring security and stability and prosperity, is not just something we need to do for the sake of people there, but ultimately it's something we need to do for our own sake so that that region doesn't become, via migration, a direct threat to us. That's what I would say.
Okay, from my perspective, I think we've talked about China a lot. I would also put India in there. I mean, by far and away, the two countries with the greatest number of people in forced labour and slavery. Yeah. Looking at China, you're looking at India. I'd also add to the point around sub-Saharan Africa, and I sort of put that climate change lens on it. It is a forced labour, human trafficking, a catastrophe that we are going to be watching in slow motion that goes alongside the environmental, degradation and climate crisis. And so I do think that from the perspective of trade and engagement, understanding what that could look like, how that could work together to help mitigate some of those climate crisis impacts that we are likely to see across that continent.
I think what's perhaps more important than where in the world is the footprint of UK institutions on human rights. You have export finance, for instance. Historically, more than 80% of all export finance has gone to the arms industry and to oil and gas. You have a public finance institution, CDC, that invests in equity in companies in DRC, for example, which practice child labour and modern forms of slavery. So I think we have to address the whole institutional framework of trade and investment. It includes regulatory bodies in the UK that historically have lacked the competence, lacked the powers, lacked the political will to be able to enforce, as we saw with the Boohoo scandal. The same will apply to any impounding of goods at customs. The framework that needs to be in place to be able to enforce these kind of measures has always been lacking in the past. And that's what we need. We need a much stronger institutional framework to address human rights in the context of trade and investment.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously totally agree with what's been said on that issue. I think I'd just like to go back to the environment because clearly, not only should human rights be absolutely fundamental to any trade agreement that we strike, so should the environment, because there's no greater human right than to carry on living on the planet and not destroying the planet. Now, obviously, coming from somebody who represents workers in the steel industry, again, you'd think, we're part of the problem, but we're not. We want to be part of the solution. Steel is set, the demand for steel is set to rise. It will continue to rise. We need to find ways, new technologies, and they are there, where we can make steel in a net zero decarbonised way. But it's a global problem. Therefore, it's the frustration we see is that we're working in this area leading up to COP26 later on in the year. There would be no point in us making all those sacrifices, making those investments and commitments, only then to import China from halfway around. Import steel from China halfway around the world, where the carbon footprint would be massive, and we'd end up destroying the planet even quicker. So I cannot understand why, and we've raised this issue with DIT. We don't get a great deal of response from them. That these environmental issues, the climate change challenges, has to be at the heart of trade talks as well, because that's part of the human rights issue.
Yeah. I just wondered if I might slightly abuse. I know I appreciate the question I've been asked, but can I give you another answer? And it's just a really colourful, example of something which is happening right now with this government. So, believe it or not, we're about to spend £11 billion on PPE in the next 2 years. And we've got these contracts that the Department for Health is giving out now in September. And I got in touch with them because I said, well, before you do that, could you make sure that you do what you didn't do last time, which is to look at the human rights records of the companies that you're going to be giving these contracts to? Because the record of Malaysia, which is where most of the rubber gloves come from, there is a terrible history of use of slaves. And so we really don't want slaves making our rubber gloves for the National Health Service. And what you could do is use all that money to actually push our agenda and to say part of the contract that we, the National Health Service, are going to give you, company in Malaysia, is that you are not to use slaves. Right. And here are the conditions, and this is how we're going to enforce it. And we will make sure that we check up on you. Have I even had an answer to that letter? No, I haven't. There's something which is happening now.
Shocking.
Yeah, really shocking. Really shocking.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for all of your brilliant questions, for being such a great audience. Thank you, Emily, for doing this event with us. If you could give a round of applause to our excellent panel.